All right, one last little piece of information, reminder really about the tangent function, and this is just to show that things work together. I have the graph of the tangent function, several periods of it. This extends from negative 3 pi over 2, there's negative pi over 2, 0, pi over 2, and so on out. I have several strips of it here. Now, I want you to bear in mind, so look at this interval, the interval from 0 to pi over 2. As we've talked about before with the sine and cosine graph, remember that these points on the x-axis between 0 and pi over 2, those x values in this picture correspond to these angles in this picture. The interval from 0 to pi over 2 in this picture corresponds to quadrant 1 angles in this picture. So there's a sense in which this piece of this number, this little interval of the number line, corresponds to quadrant 1 angles. And then similarly, the interval from pi over 2 to pi, as x goes from pi over 2 to pi, that corresponds to these angles in this picture. That corresponds to quadrant 2. And that continues as you go around, as you go along the number line, as you go around the circle. So, from pi to 3 pi over 2, that corresponds to quadrant 3 angles. And then finally, as you go from 3 pi over 2 to 2 pi, that corresponds to quadrant 4 angles. And then the cycle repeats. This is quadrant 1 again, or corresponds to quadrant 1. This corresponds to quadrant 2, and so on out. And then this, as we go in the negative direction, between 0 and negative pi over 2, that corresponds to angles 0, negative pi over 2. This corresponds to quadrant 4. This corresponds to quadrant 3. This corresponds to quadrant 2, and so on in that direction. And the last piece is, remember this. Remember, that's our little memory device for knowing when the various functions are positive in what quadrants. Tangent is positive in quadrant 1 and quadrant 3. It is negative in quadrants 2 and 4. And look, in quadrant 1, tangent should be positive. A curve is positive if the curve is above the axis. And sure enough, the tangent curve is above the axis in this quadrant, quadrant 1. But now it's below the axis in this quadrant, which corresponds to quadrant 2. That's what we should have had happen. And in quadrant, what corresponds to quadrant 3, the graph is again above the axis. That's why tangent is positive in quadrant 3. And then in quadrant 4, the curve is again below the axis. Then it's above, then it's below. And so as you go around this, you continue around the angles in standard position, you generate positive, negative, positive, negative. As far as the tangent is concerned, the tangent values are positive, negative, positive, negative, positive, negative. And that's what we see happening in this graph. And as you go in the negative direction, in quadrant 4, sure enough, quadrant 4, it's below the axis, it's negative. Then in quadrant 3, it's above the axis. Quadrant 2 is below the axis. So everything dovetails perfectly. The graph of the function corresponds to the angles which it corresponds to, or which generated it, and it corresponds to our little memory device for what quadrants the functions are positive and negative in. So that can help you remember the graph of the function. If you remember where it's positive and remembering the vertical asymptotes, that's where cosine crosses the x-axis.